Okay, so I'm going to be interviewing Astrid V.J. She is an award-winning South African writer, and she mainly writes fiction. Hello,
Hi,
I'm
how
introducing
are
you.
you?
Okay, better yet, how about you introduce yourself? Tell us about your books and the companion tale, especially.
Okay, well,
And thank you for
thank you
being
for
here, by
having
the
me,
way.
Sara. It's really nice to meet you face to face.
Very nice to meet
Uh,
you too.
for for everyone watching and to answer your question, well, I grew up in South Africa and I actually started writing when I was 12 because although I loved the fantasy genre, I was a little bit disappointed in how the books of that genre that I had access to at the time were all so predominantly white. And growing up in a multicultural society, it just didn't fit my worldview. And even the concept of multiple cultures with elves and dwarves, they still were all very Western cultures, even if they were different. And so that was what I wanted to break away from when I first started writing. And it is something that has sort of been a part of all of my works, including The Companion's Tale.
Beautiful. So, what inspired you to start writing at the age of 12?
I was reading a non-fiction book called Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock, which was well above my actual capacity to understand fully. So I only read about half the book, but it sparked an idea to write a fantasy story based in Africa with this sort of discovery of Atlantis as
Hmm.
described in that book. The Atlantis series is still in the works. Because it was my first one, it's got a long way to go to be really good. But this African occult fantasy is in the works, and I have been doing other things on the side in the meantime.
Nice. So, are you always focused on transformation fiction, and or do you like to dabble in other sorts of fiction as well?
That was the funny thing, because even though I write fantasy in a variety of subgenres, I have young adult fantasy, academy fantasy, I have the African occult fantasy, and I have fairy tale retellings. But nonetheless, when I did my training to become a transformational life coach, I suddenly realized that the one thing that all my stories have in common is this element of our human capacity to transform our lives and to actually overcome any hardship.
So, describe your creative process. Do you have any habits, any quirks, any secrets that you think are particular to you as a writer?
I'm not just a writer, and this is something that I'm sure many other writers will resonate with, is that I'm also a mother, I'm a wife, I have a day job. Writing really is the thing on the side that I do for myself. And that means I have to carve out time. I have to make time for it. And whether that's waking up an hour before everybody else needs to wake up so that I have peace and quiet to write, or going to bed after everyone else has gone to sleep,
Hmm.
that's kind of how I find the time to write. And then, of course, that doesn't happen every day. So,
Yeah.
my quirk, I guess, is that I spend a lot of time thinking about what happens next in my story. So I've written up to a point. I had to stop for whatever reason, and then I take the time while I'm taking the children to school or on the bus going to the market or whatever it is that takes up time where I have a moment to actually just think.
Hmm.
I will spend that time thinking about the story that I'm working on. And I think that really helps me a lot because it allows me to actually write a lot when I sit down. So I'll write several thousand words in the space of an hour or two
Wow.
hours. Yeah.
And do you feel like these
I'm
words,
very fast
do they
when
come
I
to you?
finally get to sit.
Do you feel like these
Sorry,
words
your question?
naturally come to you, or do you have, as in like when you are writing, do you feel like these words they come to you naturally, or do you feel like you need to be inspired to write?
I'll put out whatever comes in the time that I have. I'll make it come. Sometimes it will be very inspired and it'll just flow. Like there was one day on a group project where we'd had a telephone call and we'd sat together and we discussed, and I then knew what I was going to write for my story. And a few days later, I sat down and I wrote 5,000 words in a sitting.
Wow.
And that was just when I am inspired. Obviously, yes, there are days where that doesn't work. But
Yeah.
it's also a matter of if I've had enough time to think through the story, think through the themes, I know what I'm writing, why I'm writing it, why
Hmm.
the scenes are happening, where they're happening, then it comes more easily than in cases where I haven't really managed to formulate everything in my mind
Hmm.
properly.
You know, my favorite quote about this is by Raymond Chandler. He says, I make sure to only write when I'm inspired. So I make sure I'm inspired every morning at 9 a.m.
Yeah,
So it's like writing is a passion project, but it's also, it has to be disciplined in order to work out and to be sustainable for the long term.
very definitely, very definitely.
So I
And
would like,
I can
yes, tell
definitely
me.
say that in the last while, it's been a struggle to actually find that time or make that
Hmm.
time to write because we've had an unexpected move. My children have been sick. I've
Yeah.
been ill myself, so you go through rough patches where it's harder to do. And I think something that's very important to remember is to be kind to yourself when you go through a rough patch, so that
Totally agree.
you can then gain your energy again, put yourself together, and then have those inspiring times again.
Yes, and sometimes you actually do need those rough patches to go
Absolutely.
back to writing again.
Yes.
I would like to read a passage from the Companion's Tale, but before I do, could you give us like an overview, a sort of synopsis of the book, without any spoilers, of course, just so that when I read it, it makes sense, you know, like who Raymond is, who Elaine is.
Absolutely. Well, the Companion's Tale is an interesting one. That one came to me as a dream. So I had a dream one night, and I woke up the next morning with this vivid memory of two characters and their issue. And so that is where Elaine and Raymond were born. Elaine is the companion to a princess, and the princess dies in a tragic accident, but there are suspicions that it's not an accident. And Raymond is the investigator charged by the king to solve the potential mystery of the princess's death. So to confirm whether it was an accident or not.
Okay, very well
And I
said.
think we'll leave it at that.
Okay. So this is the part where Raymond says to Elaine that he'll accompany her to her new abode. And she says, no, Mr. Dart, my life has been the extension of another, and I must find my own way. I can't continue merely attaching myself to a new person. Perhaps one day our paths will cross again, and then you may gladly speak of that which I have refused to hear today. So this passage resonated with me because there's a Lebanese author named Gibran Khalid Gibran who says, and I quote, if you love somebody, let them go. For if they return, they were always yours. If they don't, they never were. So that passage automatically reminded me of Gibran Khalid Gibran. Do you feel like Raymond and Elaine and these experiences that they go through, they're derived from personal experience when you're writing about them?
Like I said, this one came to me from a higher plane. So it's not that closely tied to my personal experiences. Although I would say that yes, every relationship that I've written in the word Mage's Tales has a very important message about relationships, and that I definitely have drawn these ideas from those relationships around me, not least my own relationship with my
Yeah.
husband. But there is also, my parents have had a very long and healthy relationship despite some rough patches. My maternal grandparents made it to 60 years, the
Wow.
60th wedding anniversary, and I still have a very strong memory of that, along with, of course, the very lovely romantic tale of how they met at my granddad's 21st birthday party back in the 1920s,
Wow.
when it was characteristic for couples to play games, for people, you'd play games around a table. And so you'd pair up people. And my gran and my granddad paired up for every single game that night.
On purpose.
No, they were
Oh,
drawn out of a hat. It happened. That was fate.
wow. That's fate. That's destiny right there.
Yeah.
There's also another
And
part,
so,
actually. Yeah, go on.
yeah, go for it, please.
No, there's another part that also resonated with me. It's basically the thought process of Raymond Chandler. The king's investigator lived in an ashen cloud, hiding his feelings from the world, keeping every waking hour busy, so his mind would not turn to thoughts of gray eyes blazing from a head of gold. For every moment he kept the memory of Elaine at bay while awake, she haunted him more strongly in his sleep. His dreams left him no rest and only made the waking hours more unbearable. I love this because I feel my biggest pet peeve when it comes to novels is when the love story is over exaggerated, or it's melodramatic. And I feel like you portrayed this love story, like you portrayed it perfectly. The
Oh, thank you.
infatuation was very romantic, but at the same time, it was realistic. And I loved it. Like I felt like it took me back to moments in my own life where I experienced this kind of young infatuation, this puppy love. So and it's amazing. It also it made me realize how um, sort of at a loss for words, but like when the energy is right, when the energy is magnetic, and there's this chemistry between two people, one encounter, even two encounters, the difference that it can make to your heart and to your mind. So I feel like you portrayed that perfectly.
Thank you. I'm really, really glad that their relationship has resonated for you. It was a difficult one because I actually originally wrote it only from Elaine's point of view. And then I realized that, well, no, we actually need to know what's going on in Raymond's mind too.
Yeah,
And
and
so
this,
that
yeah,
passage you just read was one of the last things I wrote for the book.
um, yeah. So I guess another question I wanted to ask you. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered when you created The Companion's Tale? And you have other books too, right? The Sewing Princess and The
Yes.
Artist and His Muse. So from writing these tales, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered?
I think it was understanding the real message in each of these tales, which was much, much deeper than I'd originally thought. Because when I came up with these stories, all of them were based on dreams. And I'd originally thought of putting them together as a sort of short story collection with a frame story similar to 1001 Arabian Nights, where you have a storyteller telling the tales, and then you go
Mm-hmm.
through each tale in turn with a little bit of in between every now and then. But when I was doing my certification for my life coaching certification, my teacher trainer or my coaching trainer was standing on stage, and she had this PowerPoint slide up with the 10 steps that your client goes through when doing the course that they were teaching me. And it hit me that I already had 8 stories that matched, one for each principle in the dream building process. And so the companion's tale is the first principle, which is to define your dream, to define what it is that you want to do with your life and what is the thing that your heart
Mm-hmm.
wants to achieve. And with a little bit of it just that epiphany was just so profound, because I then realized that I can't write these as short stories because their meaning is much deeper, and which is why I've turned it into a series of novellas.
Yeah. Yeah, I got that that sense when I finished The Companion's Tale. I felt like the story was incomplete. There was more to come.
Definitely, Raymond's story, I think, is going to get its own tale. It's not planned yet. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's definitely sitting at the edge of my mind that he's got an adventure there that we're going to go on and accompany him with. Each one of the Word Mage's tales is a standalone, although they are all connected through the frame story that I created with The Apprentice Storyteller, which is its own novel. And so you can read them all on their own, or you can do something that one of my super fans has done, is that she reads The Apprentice Storyteller, and then when you get to the part where he tells the story, she goes and she picks up the Word Mage's tale and reads that story. Because I've actually interconnected them. So each one of the Word Mage's tales has a prologue and an epilogue with the storyteller. So that that connection is interwoven into all of the stories.
Okay. So what do you think makes a good story?
A relatable story that can show the reader something meaningful for their own lives in some way.
Well said. I definitely resonated with a lot in The Companion's Tale. Even though I'm not a princess, even though I do not live in a kingdom, like you said, it goes much deeper than the surface. And do you have any suggestions, any tips as a writer? Do you have any suggestions for anyone who wants to become a better writer?
Well, study the art, study the craft of writing. It's definitely something that I see a lot of people don't do enough of. And yes, it's very good. It's very important to write your story. That's definitely the first step. But understanding how storytelling works and
Yes, completely agree.
where the stages are, where things need to fit into the structure of the storytelling, that is super important. And then, of course, also understanding the language. And even if you are very skilled in the language, you will still need to get an editor. And
Yes.
the best thing one can do is to actually do 3 full stages of editing, with a developmental edit and a line edit and then a proofreading round. Because there are so many books that I read, because I do support my fellow indie authors and read and review a lot of books. There are so many amazing story ideas out there, but their implementation often falls flat because the author isn't giving the story the full attention it needs before publishing. So either they don't understand the basics of story structure to be able to give the story its best flow for a reader, or they're getting bogged down with language issues. Like one of those big ones that we all hear is the show don't tell. But how do you do that? And of course, learning how to do that is a process. But it's a hugely important one. I've just put down a book that could have been absolutely amazing. It could really be an incredible story. But because the author was telling the entire way through, everything that was happening is sort of at arm's length, and I can't get into the story, and I can't experience it with the characters, because I'm being told what they're going through and what they're experiencing, but I'm not feeling it, I'm not hearing it, I'm not sensing what they're going through.
You need to give the reader some space to imagine the scene, to feel it, to touch it in their
Absolutely,
mind. You need to give more
absolutely.
texture to the scenery and the setting and whatever is going on.
And one thing that I use a lot is the emotions. That's how I build my showing into it, because I show what the character is going through, because we all experience moments of anger. We all experience moments of intense joy. We've all been in love. And when you take your readers through that, through those emotions and experiences, then the plot becomes a lot closer, because you're able to live it with the character. It's actually a fascinating thing about our minds, is that the neurological processes of reading something versus actually living it, if it triggers the right parts of the brain, it's no different. You are living that experience. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of books that we talk about, where we lose ourselves and hours go by and then it's ended and we have a book hangover because we're still stuck in that experience that was so vivid and so real.
Yeah. You know, I'm not against telling.
Of course.
I'm sure telling is important in certain parts of the book, but I'm against just telling the entire story. I believe sometimes when it comes to emotions, for example, anger, frustration, it's better to show that the character is frustrated, as opposed to writing blatantly like, you know, X is frustrated, period. You know, it's just...
or she stamped her foot in frustration. No, we don't need that. We can have her stamp her foot and clench her hand and have her expression of frustration and not tell it. But yes, absolutely, I agree with you. There is a need for balance, because of course I have come across a couple of books that show too much too. They are rare, but it gets a bit over the...
Completely agree, yes. And I also agree with what you said about the writing craft. You have to work on your craft. That is super important. Some people say, so I know some people who are attempting to write, and they say, you know, like the school of life is sufficient in order to become a good writer, you know. But I disagree with that, because there are, of course, English is a malleable language. You know, sometimes you do have the intellectual license to bend it and to play with it, you know, to create a good story. But at the end of the day, you also have a lot of do's and don'ts that you have to abide by, you know, like character arcs, character development, show, don't tell, finding harmony
Definitely
between the plots.
Active voice versus passive voice, yes.
Exactly, like these
and
are all...
avoiding adverbs.
Because if the pace is slow, you know what, the thing about adverbs is, I'm a fan of adverbs. Stephen King says the
absolutely, and if you look at
I disagree
at 1984 is filled with adverbs. There are paragraphs that are just filled with adverbs, and it is fine. If that's your style, it's fine. But it can get a bit much, especially when the same adverb is used repeatedly.
Yeah.
And again, adverbs slip you back into the telling. And the thing is also, we use adverbs so much in our speech, because when we're talking, it kind of, you know, you add the extra inflections, the characterizations for what you're talking about. But back to the craft, I think it may be helpful to mention that, yes, okay, so I started writing when I was 12, and I wrote prolifically throughout my teens. But I made a habit of paying attention in English class, because I knew that what I was learning in English was going to help me for the writing. I even wrote one of my prologues in English and had my teacher give me feedback as part of it was a school assignment. And that helped me a lot as well. So getting feedback is also hugely important. But again, like I said, I mean, I've dedicated a large portion of my free time to writing for the past more than 20 years. And so I know for a fact that I have definitely achieved the 10,000 hours that neuroscientists say is what we need to achieve mastery in any subject.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. So yes, you're going to need to dedicate 10,000 hours to practice your writing, to get really good, to be able to sit down and write 5,000 words in the space of 2.5 hours. Yes. But I also have a degree in English literature, because I could see that I needed more. I needed more grounding. I needed the classics. I needed to understand
Yeah.
English literature to be able to then write my own,
Yeah.
if that makes
Because,
sense.
yeah. And you know, when you read, like, say, because my reading is all over the place. You know, like I'll read Murakami, and then I'll dabble with philosophy, and then I'll read Stefan Zweig, who, you know, like they're completely different writers and different
Oh,
genres and
Stefan
everything.
Zweig
So
is
I
one
feel
of
like
my
when I write, when
favorite
I
German
personally write,
authors.
really,
He
you
is. I
know, I
love his
don't meet many
work.
people that I've literally, after I read Confusion for him, that was the first book I read for him. I went to my bookkeeper. I was living in Lebanon, in Beirut at the time. I went to my bookkeeper. I'm like, Adib, I want you to get me every book there is out there for Stefan Zweig. And he got me all his books. And I just went
Oh,
on a
wow.
Stefan Zweig reading streak for 2 months straight.
That's
Confusion, The Post Office
fantastic. I haven't
Bird,
read all his books
Chess.
yet, but one of the ones that actually resonated very powerfully with me is his Castellio versus Calvin. It's very obscure, so I don't know if you've have that one.
I actually have not read
I've
that one.
never met anyone else who's actually read it. It's his sort of description of Geneva during the time of Calvin, and one of the humanist philosophers who wrote at that time, who was actually from Geneva, and who was essentially Calvin's greatest nemesis. And it was just so brilliantly done because Stefan Zweig wrote the book in 1936, just before Hitler came to power. And he essentially predicted Hitler coming to power and what that was
Wow.
going to look like. And he was warning his readers to like change history. And then, it's like I read it, and I read it the year that Trump was running for office. And I was like, oh my God, it's all the same. It's happening again.
History just repeats
Thankfully,
itself.
thankfully, Trump's term in power was not a repetition of Nazi Germany or Calvinist Geneva, but
Yeah.
it did feel very close to home when I was reading it.
They say that The World of Yesterday, I don't know if you've read it, it's basically the longest suicide letter in literature because after he published it, he was exiled to Brazil where he committed double
Oh my
suicide
gosh,
with his wife.
suicide.
Do you
Goodness,
believe
yeah.
that it is the longest suicide letter? Because I did not get that vibe when I read that book, and I've read it multiple times. I think it's the only book I've read
Yeah.
again and again over time.
I don't think I'd have to read it again to be able to see, but I don't think so. I didn't get that impression
Me
when I
neither.
read it. Yeah.
Okay, so to close this live, this wonderful live, I would like to ask you if you have any, from all the books that you have written, from your books, do you have any favorite, like a personal favorite? And if you do, why?
Well, I'll have to go with two. I can't bring it down to one. I'll have to take two. So the
Fair
first
enough.
one is my debut novel, Aspiring, which is the first part in a two-part retelling of the Grimm's lesser known fairy tale, Brother and Sister. And that one's close to my heart for three reasons. The first is it's a retelling of my favorite fairy tale, which is not commonly known. So being able to bring it back into the public consciousness was really important to me. Secondly, it's my book that's actually received an award. So that's just, especially because I spent so much time doubting myself and doubting my craft. Having received a Literary Classics Award for it was a really big deal for me and helped me see that there is worth in my writing. And the third one is that something I've discovered talking about the characters. And I have a quiz for my readers to see which of the characters in Aspiring they are. And I regularly get either the protagonist or the villain. So, and I've come to realize that Elizabeth, who is the protagonist of the story, is everything, all the worst traits and all my best traits combined into one. And over the course of the story, she actually becomes the person I strive to be. While the villain has all my worst traits and has really taken them to the dark side. So she
Wow.
is everything I could be if I were to just let go and just be my worst self.
Wow.
And that has always been a very powerful reminder to me, because I wrote that book when I was 19. So already then, sort of subconsciously, I knew what I was doing. And I actually used this book to do what psychologists call future authoring, which is to look at your worst traits and what's the worst case scenario you can slip into, and what are your best traits, and what's the best scenario you would like to strive towards, and then help their patients actually work towards achieving their best possibilities. And I kind of did that for myself without knowing what I was doing when I was 19. And the second book that is very, very close to my heart is The Apprentice Storyteller. Viola Larian, who is the apparent protagonist in this story, is she's me. She's a storyteller. She doesn't believe in herself. She has many struggles, but she is also an older character, and so I drew a lot on my grandmother for inspiration on that one. And my German grandmother was a very, very wonderful person who hid behind a curtain of steel. You know, she rarely showed her true soft nature to anyone. And I had the good fortune to get to know her a little bit better than my cousins did, at any rate, because I was the eldest. And so my sisters still remember her as being the scary grandmother. And I kind of got to know her softer side, and to experience the deeper person beneath the protective case, the armor. And so I combined that as well into Viola Larian, and she is my homage to my grandmother.
Wow. I love, by the way, the quote that you write in the beginning. I don't know what they call that in
Epigraph.
Epigraph, yes. I
Yes.
love it, by Viktor Frankl.
Yes.
I forgot it honestly, but I remember I read it and I was like,
Every
wow,
one
what
of the Word Mage's tales has a Viktor Frankl epigraph, except
oh
for The
wow.
Artist and His Muse, which has a Picasso epigraph. But what's curious is that particular quote of Picasso's is in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl,
Oh,
which is why I thought that it's fine, it can fit.
it
So
works.
the epigraph for The Companion's Tale is: love is the ultimate and the highest goal to
That's it.
which man can aspire.
That's it. And very true. So thank you so much, Astrid, for allowing me to dig into your mind and for answering all these questions and just for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much for having me. It's been a really lovely interview. Thank you.
You're welcome. I wish you the best of luck in all your writing endeavors.
Thank you. Same to you, actually.
Thank you. All right. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.